The steam from the espresso machine hissed like a serpent as Serafina Vance pulled another perfect shot, her movements economical and precise in ways that had nothing to do with coffee training. At 28, she had learned to make herself invisible in plain sight, another tired barista in a Brooklyn neighborhood where everyone minded their own business. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her olive skin bore no makeup except for the careful concealer that covered the scar running along her left temple. To the customers filing in for their morning caffeine fix, she was just Sarah, the quiet girl who remembered their orders and never asked unnecessary questions. But Serafina Vance had killed 11 men in the mountains of Afghanistan, and every morning when she tied her apron strings, she felt the weight of that knowledge settle between her shoulder blades like a familiar burden. Where are you watching from today? This story unfolds in the heart of Brooklyn, where old-world loyalty still means something and neighborhood cafes serve as sanctuaries for those seeking a fresh start. Drop your location in the comments, and let me know if your neighborhood has places like Chin's where everyone looks out for each other. Chin's Corner Cafe sat wedged between a laundromat and a small grocery store on a tree-lined street, where gentrification hadn't quite reached. The morning rush brought construction workers grabbing black coffee and mothers pushing strollers while older residents lingered over newspapers in Italian and broken English. Mr. Chun moved slowly behind the counter, his arthritis making simple tasks take twice as long as they should, but Serafina had learned to anticipate his needs. She had the register running and the pastry case restocked before he finished brewing the first pot of his special blend. The old man had hired her 6 months ago when she walked in looking like hell, carrying everything she owned in a duffel bag that screamed military, even though she had tried to make it look civilian. He never asked about her background, never questioned why someone with her obvious intelligence was applying for minimum wage work, and never commented on the way she positioned herself to watch both the front door and the back exit simultaneously. Mr. Chun understood about fresh starts and second chances, and Serafina repaid his kindness by being the most reliable employee he had ever hired. She could break down and clean the espresso machine in under 3 minutes, inventory the entire cafe in her head, and spot potential threats before they cleared the threshold. This morning, she noted the nervous energy radiating from Mr. Chun as he checked his watch for the 4th time since opening. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the day-old pastries, and she recognized the signs of someone expecting trouble. Tuesday meant collection day for Enzo Torino and his crew. Serafina had been working at the cafe for 2 weeks when she first witnessed the weekly ritual that kept Mr. Chin's business running and his family safe. 3 men in expensive suits would arrive precisely at 10:30, order nothing, and conduct a brief conversation with Mr. Chun in the back office before leaving with an envelope. The transaction took less than 5 minutes, but the tension in the air lasted for hours afterward. Mr. Chun would spend the rest of the day moving like a man walking through a minefield, careful and quiet until the next morning brought relief. Protection money, she realized. The kind of neighborhood tax that small business owners paid to ensure their windows stayed intact and their customers felt safe. In Afghanistan, she had seen similar systems operating between tribal leaders and local merchants, informal agreements that kept commerce flowing in unstable regions. The only difference was that here, the men collecting payments wore Armani instead of military fatigues. She had considered walking away that first Tuesday, finding work somewhere that didn't require her to witness the casual extortion of a decent man who had shown her kindness. But Mr. Chen needed her help, and leaving would mean abandoning him to handle the morning rush alone while worrying about men who might decide his protection payments weren't enough. Serafina had spent 3 tours watching good people suffer because the strong preyed on the weak, and she was tired of walking away from problems she could solve. So she stayed, learned the patterns, and prepared for the day when the protection arrangement might stop being mutually beneficial. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Rodriguez entered with her twin daughters, both girls clutching dollar bills and arguing about whether to split a chocolate croissant. Serafina smiled and began preparing their usual order while tracking movement on the street outside. A black sedan had parked across from the cafe, and 2 men sat inside smoking cigarettes while watching the front entrance. They had been there for 10 minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than casual observers typically lingered. Mr. Chun noticed the sedan too, his face going pale as he recognized the deviation from normal routine. Enzo usually arrived alone except for his driver, conducting business quickly before moving on to the next collection point. The additional surveillance suggested either a problem with payment or a change in the arrangement that Mr. Chun hadn't anticipated. Serafina continued making coffee while running tactical assessments in the back of her mind. The cafe had 3 exits: front door, back door through the kitchen, and a window in the bathroom that opened onto the fire escape. The walls were thin enough that sounds would carry to neighboring businesses, and Mrs. Rodriguez's daughters would need protection if violence erupted. Mr. Chun kept a baseball bat behind the counter, but his arthritis made it more symbolic than practical. She was calculating response scenarios when the black sedan disgorged 4 men instead of the usual 2. Enzo Torino stepped onto the sidewalk first, his silver hair immaculately styled, and his charcoal suit fitted perfectly across shoulders that suggested gym time rather than genetics. At 55, he moved with the confidence of a man who had never encountered meaningful opposition, his pale blue eyes scanning the street before settling on the cafe windows. Behind him came 3 younger men, their builds and positioning identifying them as muscle rather than management. Mr. Chin's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down with shaking hands. Early, Serafina noted. They were 20 minutes ahead of schedule, which either meant impatience or a message. Neither option suggested pleasant conversation. The bell chimed again as Enzo entered, his cologne preceding him like an expensive warning. His gaze swept the cafe, cataloging customers and exits with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to controlling environments. Behind him, 2 of his men positioned themselves near the front door, while the third moved toward the counter where Mr. Chun stood frozen. "Good morning, Mr. Chun," Enzo said, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that made people step aside on crowded sidewalks. His attention shifted to Serafina, who continued wiping down the espresso machine with steady hands. "And you must be the new girl I keep hearing about. Sarah, isn't it?" She met his gaze directly, noting the intelligence behind the practiced charm. "Yes, sir. Can I get you anything this morning?" "Just here to chat with my friend Chin about business," Enzo replied, but his eyes remained fixed on her face. "You know how it is with small businesses. Always something to discuss about neighborhood security and keeping everyone safe." Mrs. Rodriguez gathered her daughters closer, recognizing the tension even if she didn't understand its source. Other customers began finding reasons to finish their coffee quickly, and within minutes the cafe had emptied except for Serafina, Mr. Chun, and 4 men whose presence shifted the atmosphere from welcoming to predatory. Mr. Chun cleared his throat and gestured toward the back office. "Perhaps we could speak privately, as usual?" "Actually," Enzo said, settling onto a bar stool with deliberate casualness, "I think we'll handle things differently today. More transparent, you might say." His men spread out slightly, their positioning both casual and strategically sound. "The neighborhood's been changing, Chun. Property values going up, new businesses opening. Costs are rising for everyone." Serafina recognized the setup, the way predators establish dominance before making demands. She continued her cleaning routine while mapping the positions of all 4 men, noting that the one by the door favored his right side, and the man near the window kept touching his jacket in a way that suggested a shoulder holster. Mr. Chin's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The arrangement has worked well for many years, Mr. Torino. I have always paid on time, never caused problems. And I appreciate that loyalty, Chun. Truly. Which is why I'm giving you advance notice about the adjustment. Starting next week, your contribution to neighborhood security doubles. Call it inflation." The old man's face went ashen. "Mr. Torino, I barely manage the current amount. Business has been slow, and the new cafe 2 blocks over is taking customers. I cannot possibly." Enzo held up a hand, his expression hardening. "The neighborhood is safer because we make it safer, Chun. Your customers feel comfortable coming here because they know certain elements won't be bothering them. That service has value, and value increases over time." Serafina watched Mr. Chin's shoulders slump in defeat, recognizing the impossible position of someone caught between economic reality and extortion demands. She had seen this pattern before, in villages where protection rackets bled local businesses dry while claiming to provide security. The mathematics were always the same. Pay until you couldn't, then lose everything anyway. I need time to consider options, Mr. Chun said quietly. Perhaps speak with my nephew about a loan, or look into selling some equipment. Time is something you don't have much of, Chun. Enzo's voice carried the finality of an ultimatum. 1 week to find the money, or we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements for keeping your business secure. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Serafina felt her muscles tensing despite her attempts to maintain civilian indifference. Every instinct screamed that she should intervene, that watching good people suffer while possessing the skills to stop it made her complicit in their destruction. But intervention meant exposure, and exposure meant the end of the anonymous life she had built so carefully. Mr. Chin nodded slowly, his dignity intact even as his hope crumbled. I understand, Mr. Torino. 1 week. Enzo smiled and stood, straightening his jacket with satisfaction. I knew you were a reasonable man, Chin. That's why we've had such a good relationship all these years. He glanced at Serafina, who had moved to cleaning tables closer to their conversation. And Sarah, it was nice meeting you. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. The four men filed out as efficiently as they had entered, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats. Through the window, Serafina watched them return to their sedan and drive away, noting the license plate automatically even though she told herself it didn't matter. Mr. Chun collapsed onto a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. His hands shook as he reached for his coffee cup, and Serafina realized he was fighting back tears. She should have stayed behind the counter, maintained her cover, and let the old man process his grief privately. Instead, she found herself approaching his table with fresh coffee and the kind of determined expression that had gotten her into trouble in 3 different theaters of operation. Mr. Chun, she said quietly, settling into the chair across from him. Tell me about your nephew. The conversation with Mr. Chun had lasted barely 5 minutes, but it revealed everything Serafina needed to know about the impossible mathematics of his situation. The nephew he mentioned lived in California and hadn't spoken to the family in 3 years. The equipment he considered selling was already mortgaged to pay for his wife's medical treatments. The double protection payment wasn't just difficult, it was financially impossible without destroying the business that 3 generations of his family had built from nothing. Mr. Chun had shared these details in the broken whisper of a man accepting defeat, and Serafina found herself calculating response scenarios despite knowing that intervention would shatter the anonymous life she had constructed so carefully. She was still processing options when the bell above the front door chimed again, 40 minutes before Enzo's crew was scheduled to return. But they weren't returning for their usual collection. Enzo entered first, his movements sharp with irritation rather than the casual confidence he had displayed earlier. Behind him came the same 3 men, but their positioning had shifted from casual surveillance to aggressive intimidation. The one by the door stepped inside and turned the deadbolt, while his partner moved to flip the cafe's open sign to closed. The third man, broader than the other 2 and carrying himself like someone familiar with violence, positioned himself directly between the counter and the back exit. Mr. Chin looked up from his newspaper, confusion evident on his weathered features. Mr. Torino, I thought we agreed to discuss arrangements next week. Plans change, Chun. Enzo approached the counter with predatory focus, his earlier charm replaced by cold business efficiency. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realized I wasn't being clear enough about the urgency of the situation. Serafina continued wiping down the espresso machine, every muscle in her body coiled despite her outward calm. The tactical assessment ran automatically in the back of her mind. For hostiles, 3 exits now compromised, elderly civilian requiring protection, multiple hard surfaces that could be used as weapons or cover. Her breathing remained steady, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement as Enzo leaned across the counter. You see, Chun, I've got a business meeting this afternoon with some associates who handle collections in other neighborhoods. Enzo's voice carried the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. They're going to ask me about efficiency, about whether the local merchants understand their obligations. I need to be able to tell them that everyone in my territory is current and cooperative. Mr. Chin's hands trembled as he folded his newspaper. Mr. Torino, as I explained earlier, I need time to arrange financing. 1 week, as we discussed. The large man near the back exit stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with deliberate noise. His movement was designed to intimidate, and Serafina noted the slight favor he gave to his left leg, suggesting an old injury that might affect his mobility in a fight. She also observed the way his jacket hung slightly open, revealing the outline of a weapon in a shoulder holster. Time is a luxury I can't afford today, Chun. Enzo reached across the counter and grabbed the old man's wrist with enough force to make him wince. Either you have the money now, or you give me something else that demonstrates good faith. The physical contact triggered every alarm system Serafina had developed through 3 combat tours. In the mountains of Afghanistan, she had learned to recognize the moment when negotiation ended and violence began, and Enzo had just crossed that line. Mr. Chin's sharp intake of breath confirmed that the grip was painful, designed to establish dominance through controlled brutality. Serafina's military mind began calculating angles and timing. The man by the door stood 12 feet away, positioned to prevent escape, but not close enough to intervene quickly. The one who had flipped the sign remained near the window, his attention split between watching the street and monitoring the room. The large man by the back exit posed the greatest immediate threat, but his positioning left him vulnerable to attack from his blind side. "Mr. Torino, please," Mr. Chin gasped, trying to pull his wrist free. "You are hurting me. I'm trying to get your attention, old man." Enzo tightened his grip, and Serafina heard the small bones in Mr. Chin's wrist grinding together. "You've been in this neighborhood for 30 years. You know how things work. You pay for protection, or you find out what happens to businesses that don't." The threat was explicit now, moving beyond financial pressure into physical coercion. Serafina felt the familiar cold clarity that had kept her alive through 17 separate combat engagements, her body chemistry shifting as adrenaline sharpened her focus and slowed her perception of time. She continued cleaning the espresso machine, but her grip on the cleaning cloth had changed, and she was now positioned to reach the heavy ceramic mugs behind the counter. Mr. Chin's face had gone pale with pain and fear. "Please, I am 73 years old. I cannot work any faster, cannot find money that does not exist. Then maybe it's time for you to retire, Chun." Enzo released the old man's wrist and reached into his jacket, producing a leather folder that contained what appeared to be legal documents. "I've taken the liberty of drawing up a business transfer agreement. Very generous terms, considering the circumstances." Serafina recognized the papers for what they were: a forced sale designed to appear legitimate while transferring ownership to Enzo's organization for a fraction of the cafe's actual value. She had witnessed similar tactics in Afghanistan, where tribal leaders would pressure farmers to sell land through escalating threats disguised as business negotiations. The large man moved closer to the counter, his bulk now casting a shadow over Mr. Chin's hunched figure. "You should listen to Mr. Torino, old man. He's trying to help you retire with dignity." Mr. Chin's voice cracked as he spoke. "This business has been in my family for 30 years. My father built it with his own hands, and my son was supposed to take over before the accident. I cannot simply sign it away." "Actually, you can." Enzo produced an expensive pen and placed it next to the documents. "One signature, and all your troubles disappear. You'll have enough money to retire comfortably, and will handle the stress of running a business in this changing neighborhood." The coercion was complete now, financial pressure combined with physical intimidation and legal theft disguised as legitimate business. Serafina had seen enough. In Afghanistan, she had sworn an oath to protect innocent civilians from exactly this kind of predatory violence, and watching Mr. Chin's dignity be systematically destroyed while possessing the skills to stop it violated every principle she lived by. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats, muscle memory overriding 3 years of carefully maintained civilian behavior. Mr. Chun was shaking his head slowly when Enzo grabbed his wrist again, this time twisting it in a way that forced a cry of pain from the elderly man. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be, Chun. My associates don't appreciate delays." That was the moment Serafina's military training overrode her desire for anonymity. She moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years perfecting violence, stepping away from the espresso machine while her hand closed around the handle of a heavy ceramic mug. The large man by the counter saw her movement and started to react, but Serafina had already calculated the angles and timing required to neutralize him before he could draw his weapon. The mug left her hand with the accuracy of a thrown grenade, striking the man in the temple with enough force to drop him instantly. Before his knees hit the floor, she was already moving toward the counter where Enzo still held Mr. Chen's wrist in his brutal grip. "Hey!" the man by the window shouted, his hand reaching inside his jacket. But Serafina was already inside Enzo's reach, her left hand closing over his wrist while her right drove an elbow strike into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The blow emptied his lungs and doubled him over, releasing Mr. Chen as he fought for breath. The man by the door finally reacted, producing a pistol from his waistband, but Serafina had anticipated his response. She grabbed Enzo by his expensive jacket and spun him around as a human shield, while simultaneously vaulting over the counter with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years navigating hostile environments. "Don't move," the gunman shouted, his weapon tracking her movement, but unable to find a clear shot with his boss between them. Serafina felt the familiar calm that came with combat, her breathing steady and her vision crystal clear as she assessed the remaining threats. Two men still mobile, both armed, both caught off guard by her sudden transformation from invisible barista to lethal operator. Mr. Chen cowered behind the counter, his eyes wide with shock at witnessing violence he could never have imagined. The game had changed completely. Within the space of 30 seconds, Serafina had abandoned 3 years of careful anonymity and revealed herself as something far more dangerous than anyone in the room had anticipated. There was no returning to invisibility now, no pretending to be just another minimum wage worker trying to survive in an expensive city. She was a Navy SEAL again, and these men had just learned the difference between intimidating helpless civilians and threatening someone trained to kill. The gunman by the door hesitated for exactly the wrong amount of time, his training insufficient for a situation where his target had transformed from civilian to combatant in the span of seconds. Serafina used his uncertainty against him, shifting Enzo's weight to create a narrow window of opportunity while her free hand found the heavy glass sugar dispenser behind the counter. "Drop your weapon," the gunman commanded, but his voice carried the uncertainty of someone whose authority had suddenly become meaningless. Serafina evaluated her options with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through 17 firefights in Afghanistan. 2 armed men remained mobile, both positioned poorly for crossfire, but capable of coordinating their response if given time to recover from their initial shock. Enzo was semi-conscious and useful as a shield, but his weight would slow her movement if she needed to change position quickly. The man by the window had finally cleared his weapon from its holster, a compact pistol that suggested professional rather than street experience. His positioning gave him a better angle than his partner, but he was standing too close to the glass, creating both opportunity and risk if the situation escalated to gunfire in a confined space. "I said drop your weapon," the door gunman repeated, taking a step closer while trying to find an angle that wouldn't endanger his boss. Serafina's response came in the form of the sugar dispenser, leaving her hand with the velocity and accuracy of a pitcher's fastball. The heavy glass caught the window gunman in the center of his chest, the impact driving him backward into the plate glass with enough force to spider the entire surface. His weapon discharged once into the ceiling before clattering to the floor as he slumped against the damaged window. The door gunman spun toward the sound of breaking glass, his attention divided for the crucial half-second Serafina needed to release Enzo and vault the counter again. Her movement was fluid and practiced, the kind of tactical repositioning that came from years of close-quarters combat training where hesitation meant death. She hit the floor rolling, coming up behind the door gunman's position as he tracked her previous location. Her hand closed around his gun wrist from behind, thumb pressure on the nerve cluster that controlled grip strength, while her other arm snaked around his throat in a blood choke that would render him unconscious in less than 10 seconds. The weapon dropped from nerveless fingers as he clawed ineffectively at her forearm, his training inadequate for defending against someone who had spent 3 years learning to kill quietly and efficiently. Serafina maintained pressure for exactly the time required to ensure unconsciousness without permanent damage, then released him as he slumped to the floor. The entire engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. Serafina stood among the unconscious forms of 3 men who had entered the cafe confident in their ability to intimidate an elderly business owner, into submission. Now they lay scattered across the floor like broken toys, their weapons secured and their authority transformed into evidence of their own inadequacy. The transformation from barista to warrior had been so complete that she almost didn't recognize herself. Mr. Chun peered over the counter, his face pale with shock and his hands trembling as he surveyed the aftermath of violence he could never have imagined. The quiet girl who remembered his customers' coffee preferences had just dismantled 3 armed men with a kind of precision that suggested extensive training in controlled brutality. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ringing silence that followed combat. "What just happened?" Serafina was checking the pulse of the man she had struck with the mug when the front door opened again. The deadbolt somehow unlocked despite the unconscious gunman having secured it moments earlier. She spun toward the entrance, her body automatically shifting into a defensive crouch as she evaluated the new threat. The man who entered moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to potentially dangerous situations. He was approximately 6 feet tall with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that fit his athletic build perfectly. His olive complexion suggested Mediterranean heritage, and his dark eyes swept the cafe with the thoroughness of someone making tactical assessments. Most importantly, his hands remained visible and empty, and his posture suggested respect rather than aggression as he observed the scene before him. "Interesting morning you're having, Chun," the newcomer said, his voice carrying a slight Brooklyn accent overlaid with something that might have been second-generation Italian. His attention shifted to Serafina, who remained in her defensive position despite recognizing that he posed no immediate threat. "And you must be the reason my street suddenly sounds like a construction zone." Serafina noted the way he positioned himself just inside the doorway, close enough to retreat quickly, but far enough from the weapons scattered across the floor to appear non-threatening. His expensive watch and perfectly tailored clothing suggested wealth, but his tactical awareness and calm demeanor in the presence of violence indicated a different kind of education entirely. "Mr. Salvatore," Mr. Chun said from behind the counter, relief evident in his voice despite the circumstances. "I did not expect to see you today." The man called Salvatore smiled slightly, but his eyes never left Serafina's face as he spoke. "I was having coffee across the street when I heard what sounded like amateur hour breaking out in your establishment. Thought I should check on my favorite espresso supplier." Serafina recognized the dynamics immediately. This was someone with authority in the neighborhood, possibly the territorial superior that Enzo had mentioned during his earlier intimidation routine. The calm way he surveyed the unconscious forms and damaged cafe suggested familiarity with violence, while his obvious concern for Mr. Chin indicated some form of protective relationship. She remained in her defensive position, tracking his movements while simultaneously monitoring the 3 unconscious men for signs of recovery. Her military training demanded continued vigilance until all threats were definitively neutralized and the tactical situation was fully understood. Salvatore noticed her positioning and nodded slightly, the gesture carrying approval rather than threat. "Professional stance," he observed quietly. "Balanced weight distribution, clear sight lines to all potential threats. Positioning that allows rapid movement in any direction. Someone taught you very well." The observation was delivered in the tone of an expert evaluating another expert's work. Serafina felt her pulse quicken as she realized that her combat technique had revealed far more about her background than she had intended. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 6 months was dissolving under the scrutiny of someone who clearly understood the difference between civilian panic and military precision. "Chun, perhaps you could brew us some of that excellent espresso while I have a conversation with your employee," Salvatore suggested, his manner casual despite the 3 unconscious bodies scattered around his feet. "I suspect we have quite a bit to discuss." Mr. Chun nodded eagerly and disappeared behind the espresso machine, grateful for something familiar to focus on while processing the violence he had witnessed. The rhythmic grinding of coffee beans provided background noise as Salvatore approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Serafina maintained her defensive position but allowed him to close the distance to conversational range. Every instinct told her that this man was dangerous in ways that Enzo and his crew could never imagine, but his behavior suggested evaluation rather than aggression. She was being assessed by someone with the expertise to understand exactly what he was looking at. The way you handled 3 armed men suggests considerable training, Salvatore said quietly, stopping just outside what would be considered fighting range. The speed of your initial response, the tactical positioning, the precise application of force necessary to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. This wasn't luck or desperation. Serafina met his gaze directly, recognizing that denial would be pointless when faced with someone who clearly understood combat dynamics. I had to protect Mr. Chun, she said simply. They were hurting him. Admirable motivation, Salvatore replied. But motivation doesn't teach someone to disable 3 armed professionals in under 2 minutes. That kind of efficiency requires years of very specific education. His eyes tracked to her hands, noting calluses in locations that suggested weapons training, then to her posture, which maintained readiness despite the apparent end of immediate danger. The espresso machine hissed as Mr. Chun worked, providing cover for a conversation that was rapidly approaching territory Serafina had hoped never to navigate again. She was being interrogated by someone with the expertise to recognize military training, and her carefully constructed civilian identity was crumbling under professional scrutiny. You're not going to call the police about this, Salvatore observed, nodding toward the unconscious men. Someone with your obvious capabilities would know that official reports lead to official questions, and official questions require official answers about background and training. Serafina remained silent, recognizing the accuracy of his assessment while calculating the implications of his knowledge. This man understood operational security and the kinds of backgrounds that required anonymity in civilian life. He was offering her an alternative to police involvement, which suggested both power and pragmatic intelligence. Mr. Chin appeared with 3 perfect espresso cups, his hands steadier now that familiar routine had restored some sense of normalcy to his disrupted morning. Thank you, Chun, Salvatore said, accepting the coffee while continuing to study Serafina's face. Now, perhaps we should discuss what happens next. The 3 men on the floor were beginning to show signs of consciousness, low groans, and involuntary movement that indicated their enforced sleep was ending. Serafina automatically shifted position to maintain visual contact with all potential threats while accepting the espresso Mr. Chin offered her with obvious pride despite the circumstances. These gentlemen will need medical attention, Salvatore observed, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. Nothing permanent, but certainly enough to require explanation to their superiors about how 3 experienced collectors were defeated by a barista in a neighborhood cafe. He pulled out an expensive smartphone and made a brief call, speaking in rapid Italian that sounded like instructions for cleanup and transportation. When he finished, he returned his attention to Serafina, who had used the time to further assess his threat level and potential motivations. My associates will handle the removal and ensure that Mr. Chin's establishment returns to normal operation, Salvatore said. They will also have a conversation with these gentlemen about appropriate behavior in businesses under my protection. Serafina understood the implication immediately. Enzo's protection racket operated with the permission or ignorance of higher authority, and that authority had just witnessed his operation being dismantled by someone who clearly didn't belong in their normal calculations. The question now, Salvatore continued, sipping his espresso while 3 unconscious extortionists lay at his feet, is what we do about someone with your particular skill set appearing in my neighborhood without introduction. Salvatore's associates arrived within 10 minutes. 2 men in expensive suits who moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to cleaning up complicated situations. They worked silently, checking the pulse and pupil response of each unconscious man before lifting them with professional care and carrying them toward a black SUV parked outside. No words were exchanged, no questions asked about the circumstances that had rendered 3 armed collectors unconscious in a neighborhood cafe. Serafina watched the operation while maintaining her position near the counter, noting the way Salvatore's men handled both the removal of threats and the restoration of normalcy. One swept up broken glass and reset overturned furniture while the other collected the scattered weapons, each pistol disappearing into a leather briefcase that suggested this wasn't his first evidence recovery operation. Mr. Chun hovered nervously behind the espresso machine, still processing the transformation of his quiet morning routine into something that resembled a crime scene. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he wiped down surfaces that were already clean, the familiar motions providing comfort, while his world readjusted around the knowledge that his employee possessed capabilities he couldn't have imagined. The entire cleanup took less than 15 minutes, after which Salvatore's men departed as silently as they had arrived. The cafe returned to its previous appearance except for the spider-web crack in the front window, which Salvatore observed with the calm attention of someone calculating replacement costs. "That will be handled by this afternoon," he said to Mr. Chun, who nodded gratefully while continuing his nervous cleaning routine. Along with compensation for lost business and any other expenses related to this morning's excitement. Serafina recognized the gesture for what it was, an assumption of responsibility that extended beyond immediate damage control into longer-term protection. Salvatore was claiming Mr. Chin's establishment as part of his territory, effectively ending Enzo's collection operation through superior authority rather than official channels. "Now then," Salvatore continued, turning his full attention back to Serafina, "perhaps we could have that conversation I mentioned." She remained silent, recognizing that every word she spoke would provide additional information about her background to someone who clearly understood how to extract intelligence from casual conversation. Her military training included resistance to interrogation, but this situation fell into the complicated territory between hostile questioning and potentially beneficial negotiation. Salvatore gestured toward a table near the window, his manner suggesting invitation rather than command despite the obvious power dynamics. "Mr. Chun," he said, "perhaps you could give us a few minutes to discuss business arrangements." The elderly man nodded quickly and disappeared into the back office, grateful to escape a conversation that clearly involved elements of his neighborhood's power structure he preferred not to understand. His departure left Serafina alone with someone who had just demonstrated both the authority to manage criminal cleanup operations and the tactical knowledge to recognize elite military training. She moved to the indicated table but remained standing, her positioning allowing rapid movement toward either the front door or the back exit, while maintaining visual contact with the street outside. Old habits from 3 tours in hostile territory, where choosing the wrong seat could mean the difference between survival and capture. Salvatore noticed her tactical positioning and smiled slightly as he took the chair that put his back to the wall. "Smart placement," he observed. "Clear sight lines, multiple exit routes, positioning that doesn't silhouette you against the window. Someone taught you operational security along with hand-to-hand combat." The observation was delivered in the tone of a professional recognizing another professional's work. Serafina felt the familiar tension that came with being evaluated by someone with the expertise to understand exactly what they were seeing. Her carefully maintained civilian cover was dissolving under scrutiny that penetrated surface appearances to analyze underlying capabilities. "I took some self-defense classes," she said, offering the explanation she had prepared for exactly this kind of conversation. "When you work late shifts in the city, it pays to be prepared. Self-defense classes don't teach someone to disable 3 armed men in under 2 minutes," Salvatore replied, his dark eyes tracking her micro-expressions for signs of deception. "They don't teach tactical positioning, threat assessment, or the kind of precise force application that neutralizes without killing." His voice carried the certainty of someone who understood the difference between civilian training and military education. Serafina realized that deflection would be pointless when faced with an interrogator who clearly possessed extensive knowledge about combat techniques and their origins. "The way you moved, the weapons you improvised, the timing of your response," Salvatore continued, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone completely confident in his assessment. Everything about that engagement screamed professional training. Military professional. Serafina remained standing, her silence confirming what her body language had already revealed. Every instinct told her that this man was dangerous in ways that extended far beyond the obvious criminal authority he wielded in the neighborhood. His calm evaluation of her capabilities suggested experience with violence that made Enzo's crude intimidation tactics look amateurish by comparison. "The question is," Salvatore said, his tone shifting to something approaching curiosity, "what branch of the military produces someone with your particular skill set?" And why is she working as a barista in Brooklyn instead of using those skills in official capacity? The direct approach caught Serafina off guard, its honesty more unsettling than continued verbal sparring would have been. She found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence behind his dark eyes and the way he waited for her response without applying additional pressure. This was an interrogation designed to break resistance. It was an evaluation intended to determine her value and potential threat level. "I needed work," she said finally, offering partial truth instead of continued deflection. "The economy isn't exactly friendly to veterans, and Mr. Chun was willing to hire someone without asking complicated questions." "Veterans," Salvatore repeated, latching onto the word with obvious satisfaction. "So we're talking about military discharge rather than active duty assignment. That narrows the possibilities considerably." He stood and moved to the damaged window, his reflection creating a double image against the spider web of cracks. "Most military training focuses on operating with a team, using standard weapons, following established protocols for engagement," he said without turning around. "What I witnessed this morning was someone operating alone, improvising weapons from available materials, making real-time tactical decisions without external command structure." Serafina felt her pulse quicken as he demonstrated knowledge that went beyond general military awareness into specifics about different types of combat training. This wasn't someone making educated guesses about her background. This was someone who understood the distinctions between conventional forces and specialized units. "Special operations," Salvatore concluded, turning back to face her directly. "The kind of training that produces individuals capable of operating independently in hostile environments. Rangers, maybe, or Green Berets if we're talking Army." The accuracy of his assessment sent alarm signals through every defensive system Serafina had developed since leaving the service. She was being profiled by someone with enough knowledge to narrow her background to specific military specializations, which suggested either extensive research capabilities or personal experience with special operations personnel. But Rangers and Green Berets typically work in teams, even when operating behind enemy lines, Salvatore continued, his analysis becoming more precise with each observation. "What I saw this morning was someone comfortable with solo operations, trained in close-quarters combat that emphasizes silence and efficiency over overwhelming firepower." Serafina realized that continued silence was providing as much information as speaking would, her lack of denial confirming the accuracy of his profiling. She was trapped between revealing more than she intended and allowing him to draw conclusions that might be even more dangerous than the truth. "Navy SEALs," Salvatore said quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Elite maritime special warfare, trained for deep reconnaissance, hostage rescue, and elimination of high-value targets. Operating alone or in very small teams, often in civilian environments where collateral damage must be minimized." The precision of his identification hit Serafina like a physical blow. In less than 10 minutes of observation and analysis, this man had not only determined her military background, but correctly identified her specific specialization within the most elite units of the armed forces. The anonymity she had maintained for 6 months had been stripped away by someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Navy SEAL," she said finally, the admission feeling like surrender despite her continued tactical positioning. "Team 6, 3 tours in Afghanistan, honorable discharge 18 months ago." The words hung in the air between them, transforming their entire dynamic from interrogation to negotiation. Salvatore's expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching respect, the kind of acknowledgement one professional offers another when true capabilities are finally revealed. "Team 6, he repeated, understanding the significance immediately. "Direct action specialists, the ones they send when diplomatic solutions have failed and collateral damage is unacceptable. No wonder Enzo and his boys never saw you coming." Serafina felt simultaneously relieved and exposed, the truth finally spoken, but her operational security completely compromised. 18 months of careful anonymity had been destroyed by 30 seconds of combat that revealed everything about her background to someone with the knowledge to understand its implications. "Which brings us to the obvious question," Salvatore continued. returning to his chair with the relaxed posture of someone whose curiosity had been satisfied. Why is a decorated Navy SEAL working minimum wage in a Brooklyn cafe instead of commanding premium rates for private security work? The question touched on territory Serafina had hoped never to explain to anyone, the complicated emotions that had driven her from elite military service to anonymous civilian employment. She found herself studying his face, looking for signs of judgment or exploitation, but finding only genuine professional interest. "I want it out," she said simply. "Out of the violence. Out of the missions that required killing people who might not deserve to die. Out of the world where success is measured by body counts and tactical objectives achieved." Salvatore nodded slowly, his expression suggesting understanding rather than surprise. "Combat fatigue affects even the most elite operators," he said. "The constant stress of life-and-death decisions, the isolation from civilian life, the difficulty of maintaining relationships when your profession involves secrets that can't be shared." His insight into the psychological toll of special operations work suggested either extensive research or personal experience with similar pressures. Serafina found herself wondering about his own background, the path that had led from whatever military or law enforcement experience he possessed to his current position of authority in Brooklyn's criminal hierarchy. "But working as a barista doesn't make the training disappear," Salvatore observed. "This morning proved that when someone you care about is threatened, those skills emerge whether you want them to or not." The accuracy of his assessment unsettled her because it highlighted the internal conflict she had been struggling with since accepting employment at Mr. Chen's cafe. She had tried to leave the violence behind, but violence had a way of finding people with her capabilities regardless of their desire for peaceful anonymity. "Which brings me to a proposition," Salvatore said, his tone shifting to something approaching business negotiation. "This neighborhood could benefit from someone with your particular expertise, and you clearly care enough about the people here to risk exposure when they're threatened." Serafina felt the conversation moving toward territory she wasn't prepared to navigate, the offer of employment that would acknowledge her military background while providing the kind of purpose and compensation that barista work could never match. But accepting would mean abandoning the anonymous civilian life she had worked so hard to construct. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, recognizing that the question itself represented a form of commitment to continued conversation. "Consulting work," Salvatore replied. "Security assessments, threat evaluation, occasional problem-solving when situations require specialized handling. Nothing that would compromise your principles about unnecessary violence, but enough to keep your skills sharp and provide compensation worthy of your capabilities." The offer was carefully constructed to address her obvious concerns about returning to a world of violence while providing financial security and professional respect. Serafina realized that she was being recruited by someone who understood both her value and her reservations about utilizing military training in civilian contexts. "Mr. Chun would remain under my protection regardless," Salvatore continued, sweetening the proposition with assurance about the person who had shown her kindness. "But having someone with your background available for consultation would benefit everyone who lives and works in this neighborhood." Serafina found herself considering an offer that would acknowledge her true capabilities while providing the kind of meaningful work that minimum wage employment could never match. But acceptance would mean trusting someone whose own background remained largely mysterious despite his obvious knowledge about military special operations. "I need time to think about it," she said, recognizing that the conversation had reached a decision point that would determine the direction of her immediate future. "Of course," Salvatore replied, standing and straightening his expensive suit jacket. "Take whatever time you need. But remember that what happened here this morning changes everything whether you accept my offer or not. Your anonymity is gone, and word will spread about the barista who defeated 3 armed collectors with her bare hands." The truth of his observations settled over her like a heavy blanket. There was no returning to the invisible life she had constructed, no pretending that her military background remained secret after demonstrating elite combat capabilities in front of witnesses. The question now was whether she would control the narrative of her revelation or allow others to define her story. "My card," Salvatore said, producing an elegant business card and placing it on the table between them. "When you're ready to discuss details, call the number and someone will arrange a meeting." He moved toward the front door with the same deliberate confidence he had displayed upon entering, his manner suggesting that the outcome of their negotiation was never really in doubt. At the threshold, he paused and turned back toward her. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "what you did this morning was exactly what needed to happen. Enzo and his crew needed to learn that there are consequences for hurting innocent people, and you provided that education in a language they understand." The door closed behind him with a soft chime, leaving Serafina alone with the business card and the knowledge that her carefully constructed anonymous life had ended permanently. Mr. Chun emerged from the back office like a nervous animal testing the safety of familiar territory, his eyes moving between her face and the card on the table. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and concern, "what happens now?" Serafina picked up the business card, noting the expensive paper and simple design that provided a phone number but no identifying information about business or services offered. The weight of decision pressed against her shoulders as she realized that her choice would affect not only her own future, but the safety of everyone in the neighborhood who depended on the kind of protection that only superior authority could provide. "Now," she said, studying the card while calculating the implications of her next decision, "I figure out what kind of person I want to be." The question was whether that person would remain hidden behind a civilian facade or step forward into the light as someone capable of protecting the people who mattered most. Serafina stared at the business card for 3 full minutes after Salvatore's departure, her tactical mind processing implications while her civilian instincts screamed warnings about accepting employment from someone who clearly operated outside legal boundaries. The expensive paper felt substantial between her fingers, its simplicity suggesting an organization confident enough in its reputation to provide minimal identification. Mr. Chun had returned to his normal routine with the determined focus of someone using familiar tasks to process extraordinary circumstances. He cleaned espresso equipment that was already spotless and rearranged pastries that required no adjustment, his movements carrying the nervous energy of a man whose quiet world had been permanently altered by witnessing violence he could never have imagined. The afternoon brought regular customers who noticed the cracked window, but accepted Mr. Chin's explanation about minor vandalism without pressing for details. Serafina served coffee and handled transactions while her mind worked through the mathematics of her situation, calculating the costs and benefits of alliance with someone whose authority clearly extended beyond legitimate business operations. By closing time, she had reached a decision that felt inevitable despite her reservations about returning to a world where violence was an acceptable solution to problems. She called the number on Salvatore's card at precisely 6 o'clock, her timing deliberate rather than impulsive. The phone was answered on the second ring by a professional female voice that could have belonged to any executive assistant in any corporate office across the city. "Mr. Moretti is expecting your call," the woman said without requiring identification or explanation. "Are you available to meet this evening?" The assumption that she would call suggested confidence rather than arrogance, the kind of certainty that came from accurate assessment of personalities and motivations. Serafina found herself respecting the efficiency while noting the implications about Salvatore's ability to predict behavior patterns. "Where and when?" she asked, accepting the premise that negotiation required face-to-face conversation. "Gino's restaurant on Atlantic Avenue, 8 o'clock. Mr. Moretti has reserved the back dining room for privacy." The location was public enough to provide security while private enough to allow honest conversation about subjects that required discretion. Serafina recognized the choice as tactically sound, offering both parties the protection of witnesses while ensuring their discussion couldn't be overheard by casual observers. She spent an hour preparing for the meeting with the same careful attention she had once applied to mission briefings in Afghanistan. Conservative clothing that allowed freedom of movement, minimal jewelry that couldn't be used against her, hair pulled back to prevent visual obstruction during potential confrontation. Old habits from a world where preparation meant survival. Gino's restaurant occupied a corner building that had been serving authentic Italian cuisine to Brooklyn families for 40 years. The dining room buzzed with conversation in multiple languages, elderly men playing cards while their wives shared gossip over wine, children weaving between tables under the watchful eyes of grandparents who remembered when the neighborhood was entirely Italian. Salvatore had chosen his ground well, surrounding their negotiation with the kind of community atmosphere that discouraged violence while providing cover for sensitive conversation. The hostess guided her to the back dining room without requiring explanation, her manner suggesting that private meetings were common enough to require no special protocol. The space was intimate without being isolated, a single table set for two with quality linens and wine already breathing in expensive glasses. Salvatore rose as she entered, his manner carrying the formal courtesy that suggested genuine respect rather than calculated charm. He wore a different suit than this morning, charcoal gray instead of black, with a silk tie that probably cost more than she made in a week. But his eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had dissected her capabilities with surgical precision. "Thank you for coming," he said, waiting until she was seated before returning to his own chair. "I wasn't entirely certain you would." Serafina studied his face across the table, noting the way candlelight revealed small scars along his jawline that suggested personal experience with violence. His hands moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to potentially dangerous situations, and she realized that her assessment of him, as merely an administrative authority, had been incomplete. "I needed to understand what you're really offering," she said, accepting the wine he poured while maintaining visual contact with both the entrance and the service door. "And what you expect in return." Direct approach, Salvatore observed with obvious approval. "I appreciate that in a potential business partner. Saves time and eliminates misunderstandings that could complicate future cooperation." He settled back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone completely comfortable in his chosen environment. 20 years ago, I was where you are now," he said, his tone shifting to something approaching personal confession. "Military discharge, skills that had no civilian application, wondering whether the training that kept me alive overseas would destroy any chance of normal life back home." The admission caught Serafina off guard, reframing their entire dynamic from criminal recruitment of military asset to conversation between veterans who understood the complexities of transitioning from warfare to civilian existence. She found herself studying his face for signs of deception, but finding only the kind of recognition that came from shared experience. Marines, she guessed, noting the way he carried himself and the unconscious precision of his movements. "Force reconnaissance," Salvatore confirmed, his acknowledgement carrying the weight of mutual understanding. 3 tours in Iraq, specialized in deep reconnaissance and direct action missions. Came home to discover that civilian employment doesn't appreciate the kind of initiative that keeps soldiers alive in hostile territory. Serafina felt something shift in her chest, the recognition of finding someone who understood the specific challenges of integrating elite military training with civilian expectations. Force Recon Marines were the closest thing the Marine Corps had to Navy SEALs, operators trained for independent action in environments where backup was unavailable and mission success depended entirely on individual capability. "So you found alternative employment," she said, gesturing subtly toward their surroundings and the obvious wealth that allowed him to reserve private dining rooms for business meetings. "I found purpose," Salvatore corrected, his tone suggesting distinction between mere survival and meaningful existence. "This neighborhood needed someone with the skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves from predators like Enzo and his organization. I had those skills and the motivation to use them responsibly." The explanation reframed his criminal authority as community protection, vigilante justice applied by someone with the training and resources to succeed where official channels had failed. Serafina recognized the rationalization even as she found herself sympathetic to the underlying motivation. "And the business side of the operation?" she asked, acknowledging the obvious wealth that supported his protective activities. "Legitimate enterprises that generate the resources necessary to maintain territorial security," Salvatore replied, without defensive justification. "Construction companies that ensure neighborhood development benefits residents rather than outside investors. Security consulting that provides real protection instead of theater. Import businesses that supply quality goods to local merchants at fair prices." His description suggested a criminal organization that operated more like a community development corporation, using illegal methods to achieve socially beneficial goals that legitimate businesses couldn't or wouldn't pursue. Serafina found the model both appealing and dangerous, recognizing the potential for corruption even within well-intentioned protective structures. Their food arrived without being ordered, plates of perfectly prepared seafood that suggested the restaurant understood Salvatore's preferences without requiring detailed instruction. The service was unobtrusive but attentive, providing privacy while ensuring their conversation could continue without interruption. "What would you need from me?" Serafina asked, recognizing that continued questioning constituted negotiation rather than mere curiosity. "Security assessments for businesses under our protection, threat evaluation when situations require specialized knowledge, occasional consultation on matters that benefit from your particular expertise," Salvatore explained between bites of perfectly seasoned branzino. "Nothing that would require you to compromise principles about unnecessary violence, but enough to keep your skills sharp and provide compensation worthy of your capabilities." The offer was carefully constructed to address her obvious concerns about returning to a world of violence, while acknowledging her need for meaningful work and financial security. Serafina realized that she was being recruited by someone who understood both her value and her reservations about military applications in civilian contexts. Mr. Chun would remain protected regardless, Salvatore continued, addressing her primary concern without requiring explicit statement. "His business is now under my direct authority, which means no one collects protection money, no one threatens his customers, and no one questions his right to operate peacefully in this neighborhood." The guarantee addressed her deepest fear about accepting his offer, the possibility that her involvement might somehow compromise the safety of the man who had shown her kindness when she needed employment without questions. Knowing that Mr. Chin's protection was independent of her decision removed the primary obstacle to serious consideration. "What about boundaries?" she asked, probing the limits of what he might expect from someone with her capabilities. "I won't torture people for information, won't eliminate problems that could be solved through negotiation, won't participate in operations that target innocent civilians. All reasonable limitations that align with my own operational philosophy," Salvatore replied, his immediate acceptance suggesting that her conditions matched his existing protocols. "The goal is community protection and legitimate business success, not expansion of criminal empire through indiscriminate violence." Serafina found herself studying his face for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only the steady gaze of someone who had considered these questions thoroughly before offering her employment. His military background provided context for understanding both her capabilities and her ethical constraints, making him a more suitable employer than civilian organizations that might view her training as merely enhanced security skills. The conversation continued through multiple courses, their discussion ranging from tactical philosophy to personal experiences that shaped their respective approaches to violence and community protection. Serafina discovered that Salvatore read extensively about military history and counterinsurgency theory, his education extending far beyond street-level criminal operations into strategic thinking about sustainable community development. More importantly, she recognized in him the same struggle she faced daily: how to find meaningful purpose for skills developed in warfare when civilian life offered few outlets for their responsible application. His solution involved accepting the moral ambiguity of criminal methods applied towards socially beneficial goals, while hers had attempted complete withdrawal from any context that might require violence. This morning proved that withdrawal isn't sustainable when you care about people who need protection, Salvatore observed as their dinner wound toward conclusion. "You're too skilled and too ethical to stand aside when innocent people suffer at the hands of predators." The accuracy of his assessment unsettled her because it highlighted the internal conflict that had been building since she accepted employment at Mr. Chen's cafe. She had tried to leave the violence behind, but violence had a way of finding people with her capabilities regardless of their desire for peaceful anonymity. "I need guarantees," she said finally, recognizing that her statement constituted acceptance of his basic proposition while establishing terms for their partnership. No operations that target legitimate law enforcement, no involvement in drug trafficking or human trafficking, no assignments that require permanent elimination of targets who could be neutralized through non-lethal means. "Agreed," Salvatore replied without hesitation, his immediate acceptance suggesting that her conditions aligned with existing policies rather than requiring modification of his organization's methods. My business model depends on community support, which requires maintaining moral authority that criminal enterprises typically forfeit through indiscriminate violence. Their handshake across the table felt like the completion of something that had begun the moment she chose to protect Mr. Chun instead of preserving her anonymity. Serafina realized that she had committed herself to a partnership that would acknowledge her true capabilities while providing the kind of meaningful work that barista employment could never match. As they prepared to leave, Salvatore handed her a second business card, this one containing additional contact information and what appeared to be access codes for secure communication systems. "Welcome to the team," he said quietly, his tone carrying satisfaction that suggested the conclusion had never been seriously in doubt. "I think we're going to accomplish great things together." Walking back toward her apartment through neighborhoods that now fell under the protection of her new employer, Serafina felt simultaneously relieved and apprehensive about the path she had chosen. The anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain was permanently gone, replaced by an alliance that would put her military skills to work protecting the kind of people who mattered most. For the first time since her discharge, she had found someone who understood both her capabilities and her principles, offering meaningful employment that honored her training while respecting her ethical boundaries. The partnership felt like coming home to a world she had thought she was leaving forever. But as she noticed the subtle signs of Salvatore's territorial authority displayed throughout the neighborhood, she also realized that she had chosen to join an organization whose methods and goals would be tested by challenges she couldn't yet imagine. The question was whether their shared commitment to protecting innocent people would prove stronger than the corrupting influences that destroyed most attempts to apply criminal methods toward legitimate social goals. Only time would reveal whether she had found the perfect synthesis of her skills and principles, or simply exchanged one form of moral complexity for another. 3 months later, Serafina pulled the perfect espresso shot while simultaneously monitoring the street through Chin's newly replaced front window, her dual awareness now as natural as breathing. The morning rush had doubled since Salvatore's organization assumed protective authority over the neighborhood, regular customers drawn by the knowledge that their morning routine would remain undisturbed by the kind of predatory behavior that had once made simple errands feel dangerous. Mr. Chun moved behind the counter with renewed energy, his arthritis unchanged, but his spirit transformed by the security that came from knowing powerful people considered his welfare important. The nervous trembling that had characterized his movements during collection days had disappeared entirely, replaced by the confident gestures of a man who no longer feared for his business or his safety. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Rodriguez entered with her twin daughters, all three wearing the relaxed expressions of people who no longer worried about encountering unpleasant surprises during routine activities. The girls had grown bold enough to ask Serafina questions about her morning routine, their curiosity suggesting that neighborhood rumors about her unusual capabilities had transformed her from invisible employee into local celebrity. "Good morning, Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her greeting warm with genuine affection. "The usual for all of us?" Serafina smiled and began preparing their order, noting the way the woman's shoulders had relaxed over the past months as the atmosphere of casual intimidation that had pervaded the neighborhood gradually disappeared under Salvatore's protective oversight. Children played on streets where they had once hurried past shadowy doorways, and elderly residents lingered outside their apartments instead of rushing between destinations. The transformation extended beyond mere safety improvements into genuine community revitalization. Local businesses thrived under protection that ensured fair treatment from suppliers and customers alike, while new enterprises opened with confidence that their investments wouldn't be compromised by extortion or vandalism. Salvatore's organization had created an environment where legitimate commerce could flourish without the constant threat of predatory interference. Serafina's role in the transformation had evolved from simple consultation into genuine partnership with someone whose vision aligned with her own desire to protect innocent people from those who would exploit their vulnerability. Her morning shifts at the cafe provided cover for observation and community interaction, while her afternoons were spent applying military expertise to security assessments and strategic planning that strengthened the protective infrastructure Salvatore had built over 2 decades of careful development. The work satisfied parts of her that barista employment could never reach, utilizing skills that had been dormant since her discharge, while maintaining the ethical boundaries that made civilian employment meaningful rather than merely profitable. She found herself looking forward to both the quiet routine of morning coffee service and the complex challenges that came with ensuring neighborhood security through methods that honored rather than compromised her military training. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Salvatore requesting a meeting to discuss new intelligence about potential territorial challenges from rival organizations. The communication was brief and professional, but she had learned to read subtle emotional indicators in his carefully controlled language that suggested both respect for her expertise and personal interest that extended beyond mere business partnership. Their relationship had developed gradually through shared work and mutual understanding, built on the foundation of compatible ethical frameworks and complementary professional capabilities. Serafina found herself drawn to his combination of tactical intelligence and genuine concern for community welfare, while recognizing that his interest in her encompassed both her military skills and her personal qualities. The romantic tension had been building for weeks through late-night strategy sessions and shared meals that extended beyond business necessity into personal conversation about backgrounds, motivations, and futures that might include partnership extending beyond professional collaboration. But neither had spoken directly about feelings that complicated their working relationship, while simultaneously making it more meaningful than either had anticipated. Mr. Chun approached the counter with the satisfied expression of someone whose morning routine now included genuine happiness rather than merely successful survival. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying gratitude that had only deepened over months of security and prosperity, "I wanted to thank you again for what you did that day." The memory of violence seemed distant now, transformed by subsequent months of peace into something that felt more like a necessary medical procedure than a life-altering confrontation. Serafina had learned to integrate the knowledge of her capabilities with her desire for peaceful existence, finding balance between readiness for violence and commitment to its use only when absolutely necessary for protecting innocent people. "You don't need to keep thanking me, Mr. Chun," she replied, genuinely touched by his continued gratitude while recognizing that her decision to intervene had ultimately benefited her as much as him. "We're family now, and family protects each other." The afternoon brought a series of routine tasks that had become comfortably familiar over months of establishing patterns and refining procedures. Security consultations with local business owners who wanted professional assessment of their vulnerability to various threats, coordination with Salvatore's associates about resource allocation for community improvement projects, and strategic analysis of intelligence reports about potential challenges to territorial stability. Each assignment utilized different aspects of her military training while maintaining focus on community protection rather than aggressive expansion of criminal authority. Serafina had learned to appreciate the intellectual challenges that came with applying special operations expertise to civilian security problems, finding satisfaction in developing solutions that achieved tactical objectives through minimal violence and maximum strategic effectiveness. She was reviewing surveillance reports when Salvatore arrived for their scheduled meeting, his presence immediately transforming the cafe's atmosphere from routine afternoon business into something that felt more like a war room briefing. But his expression carried personal warmth along with professional focus, the combination that had become characteristic of their interactions over months of deepening partnership. "Good afternoon," he said, settling into the chair across from her while accepting the espresso she had prepared according to preferences learned through careful observation. "I hope your morning was productive." Mrs. Rodriguez brought her daughters by for their usual order, and they asked me to teach them some of the self-defense moves they've heard rumors about. Serafina replied with a slight smile. "I told them to ask their mother's permission first." "Wise policy," Salvatore agreed, his amusement evident despite the serious nature of their scheduled discussion. Community relations require careful balance between demonstrating capability and avoiding unnecessary intimidation of people we're supposed to protect. Their conversation shifted naturally from casual interaction into business analysis, discussing intelligence reports about potential territorial challenges while simultaneously exploring the personal dynamics that had developed through months of professional collaboration. Serafina found herself increasingly comfortable with the way their partnership balanced tactical planning with genuine personal connection. The reports suggested that rival organizations had taken notice of the prosperity and stability that characterized their neighborhood, viewing it as either a model to emulate or a target for exploitation. Salvatore's analysis indicated preference for diplomatic solutions when possible, but acknowledgement that some challenges might require the kind of decisive response that had originally brought them together. "I value your assessment of our defensive capabilities," he said, spreading maps and surveillance photographs across the table between them. "But I also want your opinion about whether we're maintaining appropriate balance between security and community welfare." The question revealed the kind of ethical complexity that made their partnership meaningful rather than merely profitable. Serafina appreciated his willingness to submit his methods to external evaluation, recognizing that power without accountability inevitably corrupted even well-intentioned protective organizations. Their analysis continued through multiple topics, ranging from tactical deployment of personnel to strategic questions about sustainable community development that honored legitimate business interests while excluding predatory exploitation. Serafina found herself impressed by the depth of his knowledge about economic development theory and social psychology, education that extended far beyond typical criminal enterprise management. As afternoon faded into evening and Mr. Chun prepared to close the cafe, their conversation gradually shifted from professional analysis into personal territory that both had been approaching cautiously for weeks. Salvatore's questions about her long-term goals revealed genuine interest in her individual welfare rather than merely her contribution to organizational effectiveness. "I've been thinking about what you said the first night we had dinner," Salvatore said quietly, his tone carrying vulnerability that contrasted with his usual confident authority. "About finding purpose for skills developed in warfare when civilian life offers few outlets for responsible application." Serafina felt her pulse quicken as their conversation approached territory they had been circling for months, the acknowledgement of feelings that complicated their professional relationship while simultaneously making it more meaningful than either had originally anticipated. "I think I've found that purpose working with you," she replied, recognizing that her admission constituted a declaration of commitment that extended beyond mere business partnership. "This work matters in ways that pure civilian employment never could, and working with someone who understands both the capabilities and the ethical constraints makes it feel sustainable rather than corrupting." Her words carried the weight of months of careful evaluation, the conclusion that their partnership offered the best possible synthesis of her military training with her desire for meaningful civilian existence. Serafina had discovered that completely abandoning violence was neither practical nor ethical when innocent people needed protection that only specialized skills could provide. Salvatore leaned forward slightly, his expression carrying the intensity that appeared when he focused completely on subjects that mattered most to him. "I've been running this organization for 15 years, he said quietly, "but working with you has changed my understanding of what we're really trying to accomplish." The admission revealed the kind of mutual transformation that occurred when compatible people found purpose through shared work and genuine partnership. Serafina realized that their collaboration had influenced his approach to leadership as much as it had helped her find meaningful application for capabilities she had thought were irrelevant to civilian life. "What did you think of Sarah's choice to trust Salvatore and join his organization? I'd love to know whether you would have made the same decision in her situation. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let me know if you think she found the right balance between her military skills and her desire for a peaceful life." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that had been building through months of shared challenges and mutual respect. Serafina felt simultaneously nervous and hopeful as she recognized that their conversation was approaching the kind of honesty that would either deepen their partnership or complicate it beyond repair. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Salvatore said finally, his declaration carrying the straightforward honesty that characterized his approach to subjects he considered important. "Not just with your capabilities or your contribution to our work, but with who you are as a person and how you've changed my understanding of what leadership should look like." The words hit her with the force of revelation despite months of building tension, transforming speculation into certainty while creating the kind of emotional vulnerability that required careful navigation between personal desires and professional responsibilities. Serafina found herself studying his face for signs of manipulation or calculation, but finding only the genuine expression of someone risking emotional exposure for authentic connection. "I've been trying not to think about how much I care about you," she replied, her own honesty matching his while acknowledging the complexity of romantic involvement between partners whose work required absolute trust and coordination. But pretending the feelings don't exist isn't making them disappear, and they're starting to affect my judgment about professional situations. Her admission created space for conversation about feelings that both had been managing carefully while building the foundation of trust and respect that made romantic partnership possible rather than merely dangerous. Serafina realized that their shared understanding of violence and community protection created unique compatibility that civilian relationships couldn't match. Their first kiss happened naturally, the culmination of months of building attraction and mutual respect that had finally found expression through honest conversation about feelings neither had planned to develop. Serafina felt the familiar certainty that came with making tactical decisions under pressure, the recognition that some risks were worth taking despite potential complications. 6 months later, Chin's Corner Cafe had become the unofficial community center for a neighborhood that had transformed from barely controlled chaos into something approaching urban paradise. Children played safely in streets patrolled by men whose authority derived from community support rather than fear, while local businesses thrived under protection that ensured fair treatment without stifling legitimate competition. Serafina moved through her morning routine with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose work aligned perfectly with both her capabilities and her ethical framework. Her engagement ring caught the light as she operated the espresso machine, the simple platinum band representing partnership with someone whose vision of community protection matched her own desire to use military training for genuinely beneficial purposes. Mr. Chun had become something approaching a father figure, his pride in her success evident in the way he introduced her to customers as his partner rather than his employee. The business had expanded into catering and private event services, growth made possible by the security and reputation that came from association with Salvatore's protective organization. Their wedding was planned for the following spring, a celebration that would formally unite two people whose partnership had already proven successful in both professional and personal contexts. Serafina had found something she had never expected to discover, a way to honor her military service while building a future that felt sustainable and meaningful. The morning sun streamed through windows that no longer bore spider web cracks from violence, illuminating a space where former Navy SEAL had learned to combine elite combat training with genuine love for the community she protected. Her transformation from anonymous barista to acknowledged protector felt complete, the integration of all parts of herself into someone capable of both deadly efficiency and nurturing care. As she prepared coffee for neighbors who trusted her with their safety and their stories, Serafina reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate anonymity to purposeful partnership with someone who understood both her capabilities and her heart. She had discovered that the right person and the right cause could transform military training from burden into gift, violence from destruction into protection, isolation into love. The bell above the door chimed as Salvatore entered for his morning espresso, his smile carrying the warmth of someone whose personal and professional happiness had been enhanced by partnership with exactly the right person. Their greeting was brief but intimate, the comfortable interaction of two people who had found in each other everything they had been seeking without quite knowing what they needed. "Good morning, Mrs. Mereditobe," he said quietly, using the name that would soon be hers while accepting the perfect espresso she had prepared according to preferences learned through months of careful attention. Serafina felt peace settle around her like armor, the knowledge that she had finally found a way to be completely herself while building something beautiful and lasting with someone who valued every aspect of who she was and who she could become. Her story had evolved from running away from violence to running toward love, from hiding her capabilities to celebrating them in service of people who mattered. The former Navy SEAL had become exactly who she was meant to be. Protector, partner, an integral part of a community that thrived under the careful attention of two people who understood that true strength was measured by the safety and happiness of those who depended on them for protection and love.